When a desperate mother prays for her captured son, the last thing she expects is compassion from her captors. But in a moment that will change both lives forever, one Sioux chief must choose between tradition and mercy. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. In the vast expanse of the Dakota Territory, 1868, the golden rays of the setting sun painted the rolling plains in hues of amber and gold. Sarah Thompson, a 32-year-old widow, stood at the door of her modest cabin, her weathered hands clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders as the cool evening breeze swept across the prairie. Her eyes, blue as the summer sky, scanned the horizon anxiously for any sign of her 12-year-old son, William. "William!" She called out, her voice carrying across the open land. Supper's nearly ready. The Thompson homestead sat isolated on the frontier, miles from the nearest settlement. Sarah and William had moved west 2 years prior, following the death of her husband, James, who had succumbed to pneumonia during a harsh winter back east. The promise of free land under the Homestead Act had drawn them to this remote corner of the Dakota Territory, where they hoped to build a new life. Inside the cabin, a pot of rabbit stew simmered over the fire, filling the small space with its savory aroma. Sarah returned to her cooking, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, while casting worried glances toward the window. William had gone to check their small trap line at the edge of the creek that afternoon, and should have returned by now. "That boy," she muttered to herself, a mixture of concern and exasperation in her voice, always losing track of time. As the minutes stretched into an hour, Sarah's worry deepened. She extinguished the cooking fire and grabbed her husband's old rifle from its place above the door. Though she had learned to shoot out of necessity, the weight of the weapon still felt foreign in her hands. Stepping outside, she noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, promising a storm before morning. "William!" she called again, louder this time, her voice tinged with growing fear. The wind carried back no reply, only the rustling of the tall prairie grass and the distant howl of a coyote. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she made her decision. She would follow the path to the creek where William had set his traps. Perhaps he had fallen and injured himself, or become lost on the way home. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the land as Sarah made her way toward the creek. She moved as quickly as she dared, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of her son's passage. The tall grass swayed around her, and the wind carried the earthy scent of the coming rain. "William!" she called periodically, straining to hear any response over the whistling wind. When she reached the creek, Sarah followed its winding path, checking each of the small traps William had set. Most remained untouched, and there was no sign that he had been there recently. A sense of dread settled in her stomach like a cold stone. As darkness descended, Sarah was forced to acknowledge that she would need to return to the cabin. Perhaps William had circled back while she was searching, and was waiting for her there. The thought gave her a momentary flicker of hope. Her journey back was slower, the darkness making the familiar landscape strange and treacherous. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as the cabin came into view, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Sarah quickened her pace, eager to see the warm glow of a lamp in the window, a sign that William had returned. But the cabin remained dark and silent. "William!" she called as she burst through the door, her voice breaking with desperation. Only silence greeted her. Sarah lit a lamp with trembling hands, casting flickering shadows across the empty room. She placed the lamp in the window, a beacon to guide her son home, and settled into a chair to wait, her husband's rifle across her lap. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof of the cabin. Thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning illuminated the night in brief, blinding flashes. Sarah sat rigid in her chair, jumping at every sound, her eyes never leaving the door. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her hands clasped in prayer, "bring my boy home safe." As the night wore on, exhaustion overtook her, and despite her determination to remain awake, Sarah drifted into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were filled with William's laughter, the sound of his footsteps running across the cabin floor, and the warmth of his small hand in hers. She awoke with a start at the sound of movement outside. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Sarah leapt to her feet, hope surging through her. "William?" she called, rushing to the door. But it was not William who greeted her. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Standing before her were 5 Sioux warriors, their faces painted for war, their expressions impassive as they regarded her with dark, steady gazes. In that moment, Sarah knew that her life, and possibly the life of her son, had changed irrevocably. The frontier that had promised them a new beginning now threatened to become their end. The warriors moved with silent efficiency, surrounding Sarah before she could retreat back into the cabin. The leader, a tall man with a hawk feather tied in his long black hair, gestured for her to step outside. Sarah gripped the doorframe, her mind racing with stories she had heard of settler women taken captive during raids. "Please," she said, knowing they likely didn't understand her words but hoping they might comprehend the desperation in her voice. "My son is missing. Have you seen a boy? A child?" The warriors exchanged glances, and Sarah detected a subtle shift in their demeanor. The leader spoke a few words in his native tongue to one of the younger warriors, who disappeared around the side of the cabin. Sarah remained frozen in place, afraid that any sudden movement might provoke violence. The young warrior returned moments later, leading a horse. Tied to its back was William, his hands bound before him, his face streaked with dirt and tears. His eyes widened in terror when he saw his mother. "Ma!" he cried out, struggling against his bonds. "William!" Sarah started forward but was restrained by a firm hand on her arm. The leader of the warriors spoke to her in his language, his voice deep and commanding. Though she couldn't understand his words, his intent was clear. They were taking her and William as captives. With practiced movements, the warriors secured Sarah's hands with leather bindings and helped her onto a horse. The leader mounted his own steed and gave a command. As one, the small party moved away from the cabin, heading west across the open prairie. Sarah twisted in her saddle to look back at the homestead, the simple cabin she and William had worked so hard to build. Would she ever see it again? The thought brought a lump to her throat, but she swallowed it down. She needed to stay strong for William. Throughout the day, they rode at a steady pace. Sarah tried to catch William's eye to offer him reassurance, but he rode several horses ahead of her. His small shoulders slumped in defeat. The warriors maintained a vigilant watch, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit or danger. By mid-afternoon, they reached a shallow river. The warriors dismounted, allowing the horses to drink while they conferred among themselves. Sarah seized the opportunity to speak to William, who had been brought to the riverbank near her. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, scanning his face and body for any sign of injury. William shook his head, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I'm sorry, Ma," he said, his voice barely audible. "I went farther than I was supposed to. I saw their camp and tried to run, but they caught me." "Shh. It's not your fault," Sarah soothed, wishing she could take him in her arms. "We'll find a way out of this, I promise." Their whispered conversation was cut short as the leader approached. Up close, Sarah could see that his face bore the lines of a man in his 40s, with eyes that held a depth of experience and authority. He studied her for a moment, then spoke a few words and gestured toward the river. One of the younger warriors brought Sarah a water skin, allowing her to drink. The cool water soothed her parched throat, and she nodded her thanks. The warrior then offered water to William, who accepted it with trembling hands. The brief rest ended too soon. They mounted their horses and continued their journey, crossing the river and heading toward a line of hills visible on the horizon. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and purples, Sarah saw smoke rising from beyond the hills. The Sioux camp. Her heart sank at the realization that they were being taken deeper into unknown territory, further from any chance of rescue. Yet a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her that there had been no violence, no cruelty in their treatment thus far. Perhaps there was reason to hope. As they crested the final hill, Sarah gasped at the sight that greeted her. A large encampment spread across the valley below, dozens of teepees arranged in a circle, with horses grazing nearby and the smoke from cooking fires rising into the evening air. Women moved about the camp, preparing the evening meal, while children played and men gathered in small groups talking. Their arrival caused a stir in the camp. People emerged from teepees and gathered to watch as the returning warriors brought their captives into the circle. Sarah felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, curious, wary, some openly hostile. She straightened her back, determined not to show fear despite the terror clawing at her insides. The leader dismounted and spoke to an elderly man who approached, his bearing regal despite his advanced years. The old man wore an elaborate headdress of eagle feathers and carried a pipe adorned with beadwork and feathers. Chief Blue Thunder, the leader of this band of Sioux, listened as the warrior who had captured Sarah and William recounted their discovery. Sarah was helped down from her horse, her legs shaky after the long ride. William was brought to stand beside her, and she pressed against him protectively. The chief approached them, his gaze penetrating as he assessed the strange white woman and her son. To Sarah's surprise, the chief spoke to her in halting English. "Why you on our land?" he asked, his voice gravelly with age. Sarah swallowed hard before answering. We didn't know it was your land, sir. The government gave us papers for the homestead." The chief's expression darkened at the mention of the government. "White man's government takes what not theirs to give," he said. "This land belonged to Sioux for many generations." Sarah had no answer for that. She had never questioned the legitimacy of their claim to the homestead. The land had been legally granted to them under the Homestead Act. But standing here, facing the people who had called this place home long before white settlers arrived, she felt the first stirrings of understanding. Chief Blue Thunder gave instructions to the women of the tribe, who came forward to take charge of the captives. Sarah and William were led to a small teepee at the edge of the camp, where their bonds were removed, though a guard was posted outside. Inside, they found buffalo robes for bedding and a small fire for warmth. As darkness fell outside, Sarah held William close, stroking his hair as she had when he was small. "Try to sleep," she whispered. "We need to keep our strength up." "Are they going to kill us, Ma?" William asked, his voice small and frightened in the darkness. Sarah pressed her lips to the top of his head. "No," she said with more conviction than she felt. "If that was their intention, they would have done so already. We just need to be patient and watch for an opportunity." As William's breathing eventually evened out in sleep, Sarah remained awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Sioux camp, distant singing, the occasional bark of a dog, the soft murmur of conversations in a language she couldn't understand. And beneath it all, the question that haunted her. What fate awaited them in this strange new world? Dawn broke over the Sioux encampment, painting the teepees with golden light. Sarah awoke to the sounds of the camp coming to life. Women calling to one another, children laughing, horses nickering. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back, and she tightened her arms around William, who still slumbered against her side. The flap of their teepee opened, and a middle-aged Sioux woman entered, carrying a wooden bowl of some kind of stew. She set it down near them and gestured for them to eat before departing without a word. Sarah gently shook William awake. "We need to eat," she said softly. "Keep up our strength." William rubbed his eyes and stared at the bowl suspiciously. "What is it?" Sarah examined the contents, a mixture of wild roots, dried berries, and what appeared to be small pieces of meat. "I'm not sure, but it smells good enough." She took a small bite and nodded encouragingly. "It's not bad. Try some." They ate in silence, both aware of the guards still stationed outside their teepee. When they had finished, Sarah set the empty bowl aside and turned to William. "Listen to me," she whispered, keeping her voice low. "We need to learn as much as we can about this place, these people. Watch everything, remember everything, and most importantly, don't do anything to anger them. Do you understand?" William nodded solemnly. "Yes, Ma." The flap opened again, and this time it was the warrior who had led their capture, the man with the hawk feather. He gestured for them to come outside. Sarah took William's hand, and they emerged into the bright morning light. The camp was a hive of activity. Women worked at various tasks, scraping hides, cooking, weaving. Children ran and played between the teepees. Men gathered in small groups, some working on weapons or tools, others talking or smoking pipes. It was a scene of ordinary domestic life that struck Sarah with its unexpected familiarity, despite the vast cultural differences. The warrior led them to the center of the camp, where Chief Blue Thunder sat before his teepee, smoking a long pipe. Several other men, presumably tribal elders or important warriors, sat in a semicircle around him. Sarah and William were brought to stand before this council. and Sarah felt William's hand tighten nervously in hers. The chief regarded them for a long moment before speaking. "You say white man's government give you our land," he said in his broken English. "You build cabin where our ancestors hunt buffalo for many generations." Sarah swallowed hard. "We meant no disrespect," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We were told the land was available for settlement. My husband died, and I needed a place to raise my son." The chief's eyes shifted to William, who stood straight back beside his mother, trying to appear brave despite his fear. "The boy's father is dead?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "2 winters ago." The chief nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something for him. He spoke at length in his native tongue to the council, occasionally gesturing toward Sarah and William. Sarah wished desperately that she could understand what was being said, what fate was being decided for them. Finally, the chief turned back to them. "You will stay. Work with women. Learn Sioux ways. Maybe then you understand what you take from us." Relief washed over Sarah. They weren't to be killed or harmed, at least not immediately. They were to be integrated into the tribe, to work alongside the Sioux women. It wasn't freedom, but it was a chance to survive, to plan, perhaps eventually to escape. "Thank you," she said, bowing her head respectfully. The chief made a dismissive gesture, and the warrior with the hawk feather led them away. As they walked through the camp, Sarah felt the curious stares of the tribe members, some hostile, others merely interested in these strange white captives. They were brought to a large teepee where several women were working on tanning hides. The warrior spoke briefly to the women, then departed, leaving Sarah and William in their care. An older woman with gray-streaked braids and a lined face approached them. "I am Morningstar," she said in surprisingly good English. "You work with us now." Sarah blinked in surprise. "You speak English well." Morningstar's expression remained impassive. "Missionaries came to our village many seasons ago. I learned their words." She pointed to a pile of hides. "You help scrape. Boy can fetch water." And so began their new life in the Sioux camp. Days turned into weeks as summer progressed across the plains. Sarah and William worked alongside the tribe's women, learning their tasks and gradually picking up words and phrases of the Sioux language. William, adaptable as children often are, seemed to absorb the language more quickly than Sarah, soon able to communicate in simple sentences with the Sioux children. Morningstar became their reluctant teacher and protector. Though never warm, she treated them fairly, and intervened when others in the tribe showed hostility. Through her, Sarah learned more about the Sioux way of life, their customs and beliefs, their deep connection to the land that white settlers were increasingly encroaching upon. "Your people build fences," Morningstar told her one day as they worked together pounding chokecherries for pemmican. "Say this land mine now, but land not for owning. Land is for all creatures. For buffalo, for wolf, for eagle, for Sioux." Sarah considered this perspective so different from the concept of property and ownership she had been raised with. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. Morningstar gave her a long look. "That is problem with white people. Never think of other ways." The warrior with the hawk feather, whom Sarah now knew was called Swift Arrow, often observed them from a distance. He rarely spoke to them directly, but Sarah sometimes caught him watching William with an unreadable expression. She learned from Morningstar that Swift Arrow had lost his own son to a white man's disease the previous winter. One evening, as the summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the prairie, Sarah sat outside their teepee, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. William had been allowed to join some of the Sioux boys in a game, and she could hear his laughter, a sound she had feared she might never hear again, mingling with that of the other children. Swift Arrow approached and sat beside her, his presence surprising her. For a long moment they watched the sunset in silence. "Your son," he finally said in halting English. "He learned Sioux ways quick." Sarah nodded. "Children adapt easily." Swift Arrow seemed to consider this. "My son," he said, touching his chest. "He was same age. Smallpox take him last winter." Sarah's heart ached for him, this man who had been her captor but who now revealed himself as a father grieving his child. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded once, accepting her sympathy. "White man bring disease. White man take our hunting grounds. Soon, nowhere for Sioux to go." Sarah had no answer for that. Since living among the Sioux, she had begun to see the settlement of the West through different eyes. The empty land that the government parceled out to homesteaders was not empty at all, but home to people with their own deep history and connection to the place. "What will happen to us?" she asked, voicing the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks. Swift Arrow was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke. "Winter soon come. We move camp to Sheltered Valley. You and boy come too." He paused, then added, "After winter, we see." It wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough to know that they would be kept alive through the winter. Sarah thanked him, and he rose to leave, pausing only to watch William for a moment, as he played with the Sioux children, his laughter carrying across the camp in the gathering twilight. Later that night, as William slept beside her in their teepee, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the weeks since their capture. William seemed almost at home here now, learning the Sioux language and customs with an ease that both amazed and troubled her. She worried that the longer they stayed, the harder it would be to return to their former life, if that was even possible anymore. And yet she could not deny that living among the Sioux had opened her eyes to truths she had never considered before. The simplistic narratives about savage Indians that she had heard back east bore little resemblance to the complex society she now witnessed daily. These were people with their own laws, customs, spirituality, and deep knowledge of the land, knowledge that had allowed them to thrive in this harsh environment for countless generations. Sarah closed her eyes and offered up a silent prayer, not just for deliverance as she had done every night since their capture, but for wisdom and understanding. Whatever happened, she knew that neither she nor William would ever see the world in quite the same way again. The first snow fell early that year, blanketing the plains in white as the Sioux prepared to move their winter camp. Sarah and William, now familiar with the rhythms of tribal life, helped with the preparations. William worked alongside the boys, learning to pack travois, while Sarah assisted the women in gathering and preserving the last of the autumn berries. 4 months had passed since their capture. Summer had given way to fall, and now winter descended upon the prairie with its characteristic swiftness. Sarah had lost track of the exact date, but she guessed it must be early November. Back at the homestead, they would have been preparing for the long winter isolation, securing the cabin against the cold, counting their preserved food stores to ensure they would last until spring. Instead, they were moving with the Sioux to a sheltered valley where the tribe traditionally spent the winter months. The valley, Swift Arrow had explained through Morning Star's translation, offered protection from the harsh winds and provided access to water and wood throughout the winter. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold. The teepees came down efficiently, the entire tribe working together with the precision born of generations of practice. Sarah watched as William helped load a travois, chatting easily in the Sioux language with the other boys. Her heart swelled with pride at his resilience, even as a pang of worry struck her. Would he remember their old life when they returned to it? As the procession began to move across the snow-covered prairie, Sarah found herself walking beside Morning Star, who had become something of a reluctant friend over the months. "Winter camp is good place," Morning Star said. "Protected from wind. Many trees for firewood, you will see." Sarah nodded, adjusting the bundle of belongings she carried. "How long will we stay there?" "Until spring comes. Until buffalo return to plains." Morning Star glanced at her. "You think of running away?" Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Sometimes." Morning Star's weathered face showed no surprise. "Where would you go? Winter on plains kills those who do not know its ways." It was true, and Sarah knew it. Even if she and William managed to slip away from the camp, they would likely freeze or starve before reaching any white settlement. Their best chance of survival was to remain with the tribe through the winter. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. Morning Star gave her a rare smile. "You learn, white woman. You learn Sioux wisdom." The journey to the winter camp took 3 days, the tribe moving at a steady pace across the vast, snow-covered landscape. They camped at night in hastily erected shelters, huddling together for warmth. William stayed close to Sarah during these nights, and they whispered together in English, maintaining that small connection to their former life. "Do you think we'll ever go home, Ma?" William asked on the 3rd night, his voice small in the darkness. Sarah stroked his hair. longer now and worn in the Sioux style. I don't know, William, but we're together, and that's what matters most. I miss our cabin, he admitted, but I like some things here too, like how everybody works together and how they teach me to track animals and speak their language. Sarah smiled in the darkness. You've learned so much. Swift Arrow says I'm quick to learn, like his son was. This was news to Sarah. He speaks to you about his son? William nodded against her shoulder. Sometimes. He says I remind him of Running Wolf. That was his son's name. He died last winter from the spotted sickness. Sarah recalled Swift Arrow watching William play, the undisguised longing in his eyes. Perhaps that explained why the warrior had taken a special interest in her son's welfare within the tribe. The following day, they reached the winter campsite. The valley was indeed sheltered, ringed by low hills and blessed with a grove of cottonwood trees, along a small, unfrozen stream. The tribe set about erecting their teepees with practiced efficiency, and by nightfall, the camp was established. Winter settled in earnest over the following weeks. Snow fell frequently, building deep drifts around the edges of the camp. The days shortened, and the tribe's activities centered around the teepees, where fires burned constantly against the bitter cold. Sarah and William shared a teepee with Morning Star and her daughter, White Fawn. The close quarters fostered a sense of family that surprised Sarah with its comfort. In the evenings, they would sit around the fire, sharing stories. Morning Star would translate the ancient Sioux tales for Sarah, while William, increasingly fluent in the Sioux language, would sometimes tell stories he remembered from the books Sarah had read to him back at the homestead. It was during one such evening, with the wind howling outside and snow falling heavily, that Chief Blue Thunder paid them a visit. His entrance brought immediate silence to the teepee. He settled himself by the fire with the dignity befitting his station, accepted the pipe that Morning Star offered, and smoked in contemplative silence for several minutes. Finally he spoke, addressing Sarah directly in his limited English. White woman, you've been with Sioux many moons now. You work hard. Learn our ways. Sarah inclined her head respectfully. Your people have taught us much. The chief nodded slowly. I watch you pray to your God each night. For your son. Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. She hadn't realized her private devotions had been observed. A mother's love, the chief continued, is same in all people. Sioux mother, white mother, all same in heart for child. He paused, seeming to search for words. I lose daughter many winters ago. Understand pain of parent who loses child. Sarah's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. I'm sorry for your loss, Chief Blue Thunder. The chief acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. When spring comes, he said, you and boy may return to your cabin if you wish. Sarah's heart leapt in her chest. Freedom, the promise of it after so many months of captivity nearly overwhelmed her. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. But, the chief continued, raising a hand, you must tell truth of Sioux. Not savage stories white people like to tell. You tell how we live, how we care for land, how we lose much to white man's hunger for more. Always more. Sarah understood then that this was not simply an act of mercy, but a strategic decision. She and William would be emissaries of sorts, able to speak of the Sioux as people rather than as the faceless, dehumanized savages of frontier tales. I will tell the truth of what I have seen, she promised. Of your people's dignity, your deep connection to the land, your rich culture. The chief studied her face as if gauging her sincerity. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, for he nodded once decisively. Good. When first grass shows, Swift Arrow take you back to cabin. After the chief departed, Sarah sat in stunned silence, tears of relief and gratitude sliding down her cheeks. William, who had understood enough of the conversation to grasp its significance, threw his arms around her. We're going home, Ma, he exclaimed. Yes, she whispered, holding him close. When spring comes. The remainder of the winter passed more quickly with the promise of freedom on the horizon. Sarah found herself observing tribal life with new intensity, knowing she would soon be expected to speak truthfully of it to others. She watched the Sioux council meetings, where decisions were made with careful deliberation and respect for all voices. She noted how children were raised with gentle discipline by the entire community, how elders were revered for their wisdom, how the tribe lived in balance with the natural world around them. She also saw the worry that shadowed the faces of the elders as they discussed the increasing encroachment of white settlers onto their traditional hunting grounds, the broken treaties, the dwindling buffalo herds. She understood, in a way she never could have before, the precariousness of the Sioux way of life in the face of westward expansion. One evening in late winter, as the days were beginning to lengthen again, Swift Arrow sought her out. They stood together at the edge of the camp, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered hills in shades of pink and gold. "When you return to White World," he said, his English having improved through regular conversations with Sarah, "what will you tell of Sioux?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I will tell them that the Sioux are people, not savages, not obstacles to be removed, but people with their own rich culture and deep wisdom. I will tell them of your generosity to me and my son, of how you could have killed us but chose mercy instead." Swift Arrow nodded slowly. "And of land. What will you say of land?" "I will say that this land has been Sioux land for generations, that your people understand it and care for it in ways that my people often fail to comprehend." A hint of a smile touched Swift Arrow's usually stoic face. "Maybe some will listen." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, though she harbored doubts. The tide of settlement seemed unstoppable, driven by the same dream of a new beginning that had brought her family west. The first green shoots of spring grass appeared in early April, pushing through the melting snow with stubborn persistence. True to the chief's word, preparations began for Sarah and William's return to their homestead. They were given gifts: a finely tanned buffalo robe, moccasins crafted by white fawn, pemmican for the journey. Morning Star embraced Sarah with uncharacteristic emotion. "You have strong heart," she said. "Remember Sioux when you return to your people." "I will never forget," Sarah promised, her own eyes wet with tears. "You have become like family to us." The morning of their departure dawned clear and mild. Swift Arrow and 2 other warriors would escort them back to their cabin, a journey expected to take 2 days. William said his goodbyes to the boys he had played with, promising to remember the skills they had taught him. Several of the women pressed additional gifts into Sarah's hands: packets of healing herbs, a beaded necklace, dried berries for the journey. Chief Blue Thunder blessed their departure with a brief ceremony, offering prayers to the Great Spirit for their safe journey. As they mounted the horses provided for them, Sarah looked back at the winter camp, at the people who had been their captors, and then, improbably, their community. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the complexity of her feelings. The journey back was made in relative silence. Swift Arrow led the way, his knowledge of the territory unerring. As they traveled, Sarah recognized landmarks from their original capture, now transformed by the changing seasons. The prairie was coming alive again, dotted with early spring wildflowers and the fresh green of new grass. Late on the second day, they crested a familiar hill, and Sarah's heart leapt at the sight below. Their cabin still stood, weathered by winter but intact. The small field they had plowed lay waiting for spring planting. Home. Swift Arrow halted the party at the top of the hill. "We go no closer," he said. "Not safe for Sioux near white settlements." Sarah understood. Relations between settlers and the Sioux had deteriorated further during the winter months, with reports of skirmishes reaching even the isolated winter camp. She slid from her horse and approached Swift Arrow. "Thank you," she said, looking up at the warrior who had captured them and who now set them free. "For my son's life, for my life, for everything you have taught us." Swift Arrow regarded her solemnly. "Remember promise to Chief. Tell truth of Sioux." "I will," Sarah assured him. She hesitated, then added, "Your son, Running Wolf. He would be proud of his father's mercy." Something flickered in Swift Arrow's eyes. Pain, remembrance, perhaps a touch of gratitude for the acknowledgement of his loss. He nodded once, then turned his horse away. Sarah and William stood at the top of the hill, watching as the 3 warriors rode back toward the distant winter camp, their figures gradually diminishing until they were swallowed by the vastness of the prairie. Then hand in hand, mother and son began the walk down to their cabin, to the life that waited to be reclaimed. Yet Sarah knew, as they approached the weathered door of their homestead, that they returned, changed, The frontier would never look the same to her again. The empty land she had claimed was filled with history, with people whose connection to it stretched back generations. She had been granted not just mercy, but wisdom, a broader perspective that she was now obligated to share. "What happens now, Ma?" William asked as they stood before their cabin door. Sarah smiled down at her son, whose face had thinned and matured during their months with the Sioux, whose eyes held knowledge beyond his years. "Now we begin again," she said, "and we remember." As they stepped across the threshold into their old life, Sarah silently renewed her promise to Chief Blue Thunder. She would tell the truth of the Sioux, their dignity, their humanity, their struggle. It was a small thing, perhaps, against the inexorable tide of westward expansion, but it was what she could offer in return for the mercy that had been shown to her and her son. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and golden in the late afternoon sun, the land that had been home to the Sioux for countless generations, the land that had nearly claimed their lives and then, improbably, given them a new understanding of what it meant to truly belong.